Tenshira X Wednesday by Rimuchi. SWORDMANSHIP. The forest near Jericho was dense and foreboding, its trees towering high, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. The ground was soft and muddy from the relentless rain, and every step squelched unpleasantly underfoot. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of wet leaves and decay, and faint mist curled around the bases of the trees. The steady patter of rain hitting the canopy above created an ominous rhythm, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Two figures stood amidst the gloom, their flashlights cutting narrow beams of light through the darkness. One was the sheriff of Jericho, a man with a tired face and deep-set eyes that seemed accustomed to scenes like this. Beside him stood one of his deputies, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand on her flashlight. Between them, sprawled on the muddy ground, was a severed human torso. Its edges were jagged and unnatural, as though torn apart with something far more brutal than any weapon. The sheriff exhaled heavily, adjusting his hat against the rain. "Looks like another murder," he said grimly, his voice low but carrying a weight of inevitability. The deputy nodded, her expression grim. She pointed her flashlight toward the base of a nearby tree, where something pale dangled limply. "There's a hand," she said flatly. Then, sweeping the light to another direction, she added, "And over there, that's a leg." The sheriff followed the light, his brow furrowing deeper as he took in the scene. The deputy straightened and looked back at him, rain dripping from her coat. "It's all the same, Sheriff. Matches the murder from last week." The sheriff knelt beside the torso, examining the edges of the wounds with a practiced eye. "Whoever's doing this, they're not human," he muttered, almost to himself. The deputy hesitated before speaking, her voice laced with skepticism. "Are you saying you believe in monsters now?" The sheriff stood up, shaking his head. "No, I'm not saying that," he replied, his tone firm. "But I do suspect all of this is connected to Nevermore Academy." The deputy's eyebrows rose slightly, though she didn't respond immediately. "Still no proof?" she asked after a moment. "None," the sheriff admitted, frustration creeping into his voice. The deputy gave a curt nod, then turned toward the rest of the team combing the forest nearby. "All right, spread out," she called, her voice sharp and commanding. "Search the area, find anything. At least a clue." The sheriff watched her walk away, his hands on his hips as rain streamed down his face. He sighed heavily, casting one last look at the mangled body before trudging after the others, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. Unbeknownst to the group, a shadow moved silently among the trees, blending perfectly with the darkness. Perched high in the branches, Claw, Rimuru's silent servant, observed the scene with unblinking precision. His featureless face tilted slightly, as if considering the humans below. The rain continued to pour as the search party fanned out, oblivious to the silent predator lurking above them. Back in Nevermore Academy. In Rimuru's room. The room within Nevermore Academy that belonged to Rimuru Nightshade was unlike any other in the school. It was a reflection of his dark and twisted nature, a perfect blend of gothic horror and modern sophistication. The walls were painted a deep, blood-red hue, with intricate black carvings that resembled crawling vines and sharp thorns snaking across their surfaces. A massive chandelier hung from the high ceiling, its glass shards resembling dripping icicles, casting an eerie glow that oscillated between dim crimson and icy white. The furniture was sleek yet sinister, black leather chairs with sharp, angular frames, a desk carved from polished obsidian, and shelves filled with ancient tomes, skulls, and strange artifacts that radiated ominous energy. The centerpiece of the room was Rimuru's bed, a massive four-poster draped with thick, shadowy curtains and adorned with blood-red sheets. The posts were carved into twisting figures of creatures mid-scream, their haunting visages frozen in eternal agony. Even the air in the room seemed unnaturally cold, as if the darkness itself had claimed it. Rimuru lay on his bed, staring at the canopy above, his crimson eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The shadows around him seemed alive, twisting and curling as if feeding off his presence. He let out an exasperated sigh, turning onto his side, then onto his back again. Sleep eluded him, but the reason remained unknown, and it gnawed at him. He clenched his teeth, his irritation mounting. After another fruitless attempt at sleep, Rimuru threw back the covers and sat up. His pale, flawless skin seemed almost luminescent in the faint light of the room. His black, silk pajamas whispered softly as he moved, rising to his feet with predatory grace. He walked across the room, his bare feet soundless against the cold stone floor. His eyes glimmered as he glanced over the room's many decorations, a collection of weapons on one wall, a mirror framed with sharp, jagged edges, and a large, ornate clock ticking with an unnatural rhythm. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind restless. Why can't I sleep? He wondered, his thoughts dark and brooding. The room felt too quiet, despite its unnerving ambiance, and his twisted mind demanded distraction. Suddenly, a ripple passed through the shadows near the far corner of the room. Rimuru stopped mid-step, his sharp eyes snapping toward the disturbance. A figure began to form, emerging from the darkness like a wraith. It was Claw, Rimuru's shadow familiar. Claw's appearance was unnerving, almost an uncanny reflection of Rimuru himself. His body was humanoid, his frame identical in build to Rimuru's, but his skin was a stark, alabaster white that seemed to absorb the dim light. His hair was pure white, falling in soft, straight strands that framed his faceless head. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, an unnerving void. Claw, Rimuru said, his voice low and commanding. He crossed his arms, his cold expression betraying the faintest flicker of curiosity. What have you found about the hand? Claw tilted his head, his movements fluid yet unnatural, like a shadow attempting to mimic human behavior. He raised one hand and pointed to his other, which began to shift and contort. Using his powers, Claw formed his hand into a smaller replica of the disembodied hand he had been tasked to investigate. Rimuru's eyes narrowed as he watched Claw's silent explanation. The mimicry was eerily accurate. Claw's imitation of the hand's movements was almost lifelike. The smaller hand crawled along Claw's arm, drumming its fingers and making expressive gestures. So it's called thing, Rimuru muttered, his tone dripping with disdain and mild curiosity. And it belongs to the Addams family. How quaint. Claw nodded, his faceless head tilting slightly as if to confirm. He shifted his stance and began to mimic a scene, a hand climbing onto a shoulder, performing small tasks, and even slapping an imaginary person. Through his silent demonstration, Claw conveyed the essence of Thing's role, a loyal servant to the Addams family, resourceful and surprisingly intelligent despite being nothing more than a severed hand. Rimuru watched intently, his crimson eyes narrowing as he absorbed the information. A disembodied hand that serves as a loyal companion. That's certainly unusual, but the Addams family seems to thrive on the unusual. Claw paused, his hands now shifting to illustrate something else. He mimicked a scene of a hand fighting against an unseen enemy, protecting an invisible figure. Then, with exaggerated gestures, he pointed to himself and then curled his fingers inward, mimicking the idea of being cursed. A curse, Rimuru murmured, piecing it together. So Thing was once human, or at least something close to it. He leaned back slightly, his mind racing as Claw continued his silent tale. The explanation was sparse, but Rimuru gleaned enough. Thing had once been a loyal servant to the Addams family, and after committing some act of bravery, likely saving a member of the family, he had been cursed to exist in his current form. Despite this, Thing remained fiercely loyal, serving the family with unyielding dedication. Rimuru smirked, a cold, twisted smile spreading across his face. Fascinating, he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. Even as a severed hand, this thing has more purpose than most people. The Addams family is proving to be more interesting than I anticipated. Claw stood still, his featureless face unreadable as he awaited further instructions. Rimuru stepped closer, his piercing gaze meeting the void where Claw's eyes would have been. You've done well, he said, his tone a rare mix of satisfaction and condescension. Continue to keep an eye on the Addams family. I want to know everything, every secret, every oddity. Leave no stone unturned. Claw nodded, the motion smooth and fluid. Without a sound, he dissolved back into the shadows, his form dispersing like smoke until the room was once again empty. Rimuru stood in silence for a moment, his twisted smirk returning as he turned his gaze toward the window. Rain continued to patter against the glass, and the darkness outside seemed to echo his thoughts. The Addams family, he murmured to himself, his voice soft yet chilling. They're far more mysterious than they appear. And I do love a good mystery. With that, Rimuru turned back to his room, his steps deliberate as he returned to his pacing. His mind was now alight with schemes and possibilities, his earlier restlessness forgotten. Whatever secrets the Addams family held, Rimuru was determined to uncover them. And when he did, he would decide whether they were worth his interest, or his disdain. In Wednesday, S and Enid's room. The room was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Wednesday's boots. The darkness of her side of the dorm room was fittingly somber, with black tapestries and an assortment of macabre curiosities arranged with unnerving precision. Her hands worked methodically, tearing away the vibrant, cheery stickers plastered on her side of the wall. Little rainbows, smiling suns, and glittery flowers met their end as she tossed them onto the floor in disdain. Her lips curled into a faint sneer as she ripped away another sticker, muttering under her breath about the assault on her aesthetic sensibilities. The door to the room suddenly swung open, breaking her focus. Enid burst in, her usual whirlwind of energy and bright colors trailing behind her. She froze mid-step, her jaw dropping as she took in the scene. "What are you doing?" Enid exclaimed, her voice high-pitched with shock. Without turning around, Wednesday replied, "Exercising your glitter-drenched attempts at decoration." Enid's eyes darted to the pile of stickers at Wednesday's feet. "You don't have to do that. I spent hours putting those up," she protested, stepping forward. Wednesday ignored her, peeling another sticker off the wall with deliberate precision. She turned, holding the offending sticker between her fingers, and tossed it into the pile on Enid's side of the room. "Your side already resembles a unicorn massacre. I see no reason to extend that chaos to mine." Enid crossed her arms, visibly frustrated. "This is supposed to be our room, Wednesday. We're supposed to share it." "I am sharing it," Wednesday said flatly as she moved to her desk and sat down. "Your side is a cacophony of rainbows. My side will remain a sanctuary of order and darkness." Enid huffed but said nothing. She watched as Wednesday arranged her typewriter, her movements sharp and deliberate. Wednesday sat down and began typing, her fingers striking the keys with a rhythmic, almost mechanical precision. Enid hesitated, then finally broke the silence. "What are you writing?" she asked, her tone softer now. "A novel," Wednesday replied without looking up. "Oh," Enid said, her curiosity piqued. "What's it about?" Wednesday paused for a fraction of a second, her dark eyes flicking toward Enid before returning to the typewriter. "A murder mystery. The protagonist is a brilliant young woman who solves the crime by outsmarting everyone around her." Enid's eyebrows shot up. "Wow, that's intense. But kind of cool, I guess. I'm working on something too, my vlog. My viewers love my updates." Wednesday's typing stopped, and she slowly turned to face Enid. "Your viewers enjoy listening to you prattle about nail polish and wolf claws. That's not writing, that's verbal pollution." Enid's jaw dropped. "That's not true. My viewers love me. They always leave the nicest comments." Wednesday stood up, her black boots clicking against the floor as she walked to the center of the room. "Your viewers are delusional," she said, her tone ice cold. "They communicate using silly pictures instead of words. They're incapable of coherent thought." Enid frowned, trying to process the insult. "Are you talking about emojis?" she asked. "Yes," Wednesday said with a slight sneer. "Emojis are the lowest form of communication. Do you know what emoji comes to mind when I think of you?" Enid crossed her arms defensively. "What? A glittering rainbow vomiting a unicorn," Wednesday replied without hesitation. Enid's cheeks flushed with anger. "You're an actual freak," she snapped. Wednesday's expression darkened. She took a step forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice low and threatening. Enid stood her ground, her claws suddenly extending from her fingers. She held them up, her blue-tipped nails gleaming like small daggers. "This kitten has claws," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not afraid to use them." The tension in the room crackled like electricity. Both girls stared at each other, neither backing down. A knock at the door shattered the moment. They both froze, their heads turning toward the sound. The door creaked open, and a tall woman with fiery red hair stepped inside. She smiled warmly, her presence instantly diffusing the tension. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked, her tone light. "No," Wednesday said, her expression unreadable. "I was about to thank Enid, in her sleep." The red-haired woman chuckled and stepped further into the room. "I'm Marilyn Thornhill," she introduced herself. "Your dorm mother and a botany teacher here at Nevermore. I like to check in on my students, make sure everything's running smoothly." She held out a single black flower toward Wednesday. "A little welcome gift. I give each of my students a flower that matches their personality." Wednesday took the flower, her expression softening slightly as she examined it. "A black dahlia," she said, her tone almost approving. "Do you know what this symbolizes?" Marilyn nodded. "Of course. It's named after your favorite unsolved murder mystery, isn't it?" The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the statement hanging in the air. Wednesday finally sighed and muttered, "Thank you." Marilyn smiled. "Okie dokie. Now, about the rules," she said, glancing between the two girls. "No using claws, no loud music, and," she looked directly at Wednesday, "no murdering your roommate in her sleep. Understand?" Neither girl responded, their silence a reluctant agreement. "Good," Marilyn said, her tone cheerful. She turned to leave but paused at the door. Good night, girls, she said with a smile before closing the door behind her. Enid let out a long sigh and flopped onto her bed. She seems nice, she said, staring at the ceiling. Wednesday returned to her typewriter without a word, the rhythmic clacking of the keys resuming almost immediately. The room fell into an uneasy silence, but it didn't last long. Enid suddenly sat up, her eyes wide. What was that? She whispered. Wednesday stopped typing and turned to look at her. What are you talking about? I saw something, Enid said, her voice shaking slightly. Something white. It looked like hair. It was there, and then it wasn't. Wednesday stared at her, unimpressed. Perhaps your imagination is as overactive as your wardrobe. Enid frowned but didn't argue. Maybe, she muttered, lying back down and pulling the covers over herself. Wednesday watched her for a moment before turning back to her typewriter. The sound of the keys filled the room again, but every so often, Wednesday would pause. The faint sound of something, like the wind, but not quite, whispered through the room. The windows were closed, and the source of the noise remained a mystery. Wednesday's fingers hovered over the keys as she listened. She didn't believe in coincidences, and the uneasy feeling settling over her made her think this wasn't one. But for now, she said nothing, letting the shadows keep their secrets as she continued to type. Next day, the sound of clashing swords echoed through the spacious training hall as Rimuru sat in the shadows, observing the ongoing swordsmanship class with a mixture of disinterest and mild curiosity. The room was lit by tall windows, casting streams of sunlight onto the polished floor. Despite the vibrant scene, Rimuru found the entire affair dull. His arms were crossed, his crimson and black uniform marking him as distinct from the rest of the students. At the center of the room, two students were sparring under the watchful eyes of the teacher. Bianca Barkley, her confidence radiating like a predator ready to strike, stood opposite Rowan, who looked determined but hesitant. Bianca's every move exuded grace and precision, while Rowan's stance betrayed a lack of confidence. Begin, the teacher called out. Rowan charged first, his sword swinging downward in a broad arc. Bianca sidestepped with ease, countering with a swift jab that Rowan barely deflected. They circled each other, their blades clanging in a rhythmic dance. Bianca's movements were fluid, almost effortless, as if she were simply toying with her opponent. Rowan, by contrast, appeared strained, his footwork uneven and his strikes increasingly desperate. Rimuru leaned back against the wall, his piercing gaze fixed on the match. This is boring, he thought, stifling a yawn. Suddenly, Raphael's voice echoed in his mind, its tone mechanical yet oddly familiar. Less than analyzing combat styles. Suggestion. Copy swordsmanship techniques for immediate mastery. Greater than. Rimuru smirked, his crimson eyes narrowing slightly. No, if I copied it, this entire charade would be even more disappointing. Less than acknowledged. Canceling suggestion. Greater than Raphael replied, its voice fading into silence. Just as Rimuru let out a sigh, the door to the training hall creaked open. All eyes turned to the figure stepping inside. Wednesday Addams entered with her signature unyielding stride, her black uniform immaculate and devoid of unnecessary ornamentation, much like Rimuru's own, though his was accented with crimson. Her presence demanded attention without effort, and even Rimuru's interest piqued ever so slightly. Wednesday walked calmly to where the sparring match between Bianca and Rowan was reaching its conclusion. Bianca delivered a sharp strike that disarmed Rowan, causing him to stumble and fall. The teacher called the match in Bianca's favor. Rowan pulled off his helmet, frustration etched across his face. She cheated, he exclaimed, glaring at Bianca. Bianca smirked, removing her helmet and flipping her braids over her shoulder. Or maybe you should try harder, she retorted. A little more training might help. Rowan grumbled but said nothing, retreating to the side as Bianca turned to the teacher. When will I get a real challenge? She asked, her tone dripping with arrogance. Everyone here is too weak to even keep up. From his spot in the corner, Rimuru's eyes narrowed slightly. Annoying girl, he thought. Raphael's voice returned. Less than, suggestion. Erase her from existence. Greater than. Rimuru chuckled quietly to himself. No need for that, Raphael. But I appreciate the thought. Wednesday stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. I'll challenge you. Bianca turned, her eyebrows raising as she took in Wednesday's petite frame and pale complexion. You're that Addams girl, right? She said with a smirk. Sure, I'll take you on. This might be entertaining. Wednesday's lips curled into a faint smile, her dark eyes gleaming with quiet malice. I'm more than enough, she replied. I'd love to see what a self-proclaimed queen bee can do. Bianca's smirk faltered for a moment. Your mouth is bigger than I thought, she shot back. Wednesday tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. Fun fact about bees: if you pull out their stinger, they die. The room fell silent as the tension between the two girls thickened. The teacher finally intervened. On guard, he said, motioning for them to prepare. Both girls donned their helmets and took their positions. Rimuru leaned forward slightly, his curiosity finally piqued. Let's see what this Wednesday Addams can do, he thought, a faintly wicked smile playing on his lips. The teacher raised his hand, then dropped it. Begin. Wednesday and Bianca lunged at each other, their swords clashing with a metallic ring. Bianca's strikes were fast and aggressive, but Wednesday's defense was calculated, almost surgical. She parried each blow with precision, her movements devoid of wasted effort. Bianca lunged, attempting to break through Wednesday's guard, but Wednesday sidestepped, her sword grazing Bianca's shoulder. Point for Wednesday, the teacher announced. Bianca's jaw tightened beneath her helmet. They reset, and the teacher gave the signal to begin again. This time, Bianca came in even more aggressively, her strikes faster and more relentless. Wednesday deflected most of them, but Bianca's sheer force eventually broke through, her blade tapping Wednesday's side. Point for Bianca, the teacher declared. It's tied. Bianca pulled off her helmet, her braids swaying as she turned to Wednesday. Beginner's luck, she said smugly. Wednesday removed her helmet as well, her expression calm and unbothered. Let's raise the stakes, she said, her tone cold. Military protocol. First blood wins. The room went still. Rimuru stood up, intrigued by the sudden turn of events. He walked over to stand beside the teacher, his red eyes gleaming with anticipation. The teacher looked at Bianca. Are you sure about this? Bianca glanced at Wednesday, then back at the teacher. I agree, she said, a confident smile on her face. She turned to Wednesday. Let's see if your blood runs black and white. Both girls tossed their helmets aside, their swords at the ready. The teacher raised his hand once more. Begin. The final round was fierce. Bianca came at Wednesday with everything she had, her strikes fast and relentless. Wednesday dodged and parried, her movements a mixture of precision and instinct. The clash of their swords reverberated through the room as the students watched in stunned silence. Finally, Bianca managed to graze Wednesday's forehead. A thin line of red appeared, a drop of blood sliding down her pale skin. Bianca lowered her sword, a triumphant smirk on her face. Looks like you've got the color you wanted, she said mockingly. Wednesday wiped the blood away with her hand, her dark eyes locking onto Bianca's. Perhaps, she said, her tone icy, but even the strongest bees eventually meet their match. The room fell silent as Wednesday wiped the blood from her forehead, her icy gaze still locked onto Bianca's. Before anyone could break the tension, the sound of slow, deliberate clapping echoed across the training hall. All eyes turned toward the source, Rimuru Nightshade, leaning casually against the wall, his crimson eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Impressive, he said, his voice low and smooth, almost teasing. Wednesday Addams, isn't it? Wednesday didn't respond, her face a mask of indifference. Bianca, on the other hand, scowled. What do you want, Nightshade? She snapped, her tone laced with irritation. Haven't you had enough of sitting there doing nothing? Rimuru ignored her completely, his focus solely on Wednesday. He walked forward slowly, his movements predatory, like a shadow creeping across the room. Stopping in front of Wednesday, he tilted his head slightly, a small, unsettling smile playing on his lips. The Addams bloodline, he murmured, his voice dripping with curiosity. Fascinating. I've heard a lot about it, but seeing it firsthand, his fingers reached out, brushing against the wound on Wednesday's forehead. The light touch was cold, calculated. Pure talent, he whispered, his smile widening. I like that. Wednesday's dark eyes narrowed, but she remained silent, watching him with a mix of caution and intrigue. Bianca crossed her arms, her irritation growing. What's your deal, Nightshade? You and her seem to have a lot in common, creepy and full of yourselves. Rimuru didn't even glance at her. Instead, he turned to the teacher, his expression shifting into one of playful amusement. Mind if I have a go? He asked, gesturing toward Bianca with a flick of his wrist. She's so confident, I'd like to see what she's capable of. The teacher hesitated, his brows furrowing. Before he could reply, Bianca sighed dramatically. Great. Another idiot looking to embarrass himself, she muttered, rolling her eyes. Rimuru's grin grew wider, his crimson gaze gleaming with something almost sinister. I'd like to use the same rules Wednesday proposed, he said, his voice casual but laced with a dark edge. First blood. Only one slash, though. Is that all right? The teacher frowned, clearly uneasy. And why is that? Because, Rimuru replied, his tone almost sing-song, it makes things more fun. The teacher opened his mouth to protest, but Bianca interrupted, stepping forward with a smirk. I accept, she said confidently. Let's get this over with. The teacher sighed heavily, looking between the two of them. Fine. Get ready, then. Rimuru stepped to the center of the room, retrieving a sword from the rack. He held it lazily in one hand, the blade resting against the floor as if it were a toy. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, as he stood opposite Bianca. Bianca readied herself, gripping her sword tightly and taking a defensive stance. You don't even look ready, she sneered. Rimuru tilted his head, his smile never wavering. Oh, I'm ready. The teacher raised his hand. Begin. Bianca lunged forward immediately, her blade slicing through the air with precision. Rimuru didn't move, not at first. He shifted slightly to the side, her strike missing him by inches. She followed up with a flurry of attacks, each one faster and more aggressive than the last, but Rimuru avoided them all with minimal effort. He moved like a shadow, his steps fluid and silent, his expression calm and detached. Bianca's frustration grew with each failed attempt. Stand still, you coward. She snapped, swinging her sword with even more force. Rimuru's smile widened. If you insist. He stepped forward suddenly, his movements a blur. Before Bianca could react, he closed the distance between them. Her sword struck true, piercing straight through his abdomen. The room fell deathly silent as everyone froze, staring in shock. Even the teacher looked pale. Bianca's eyes widened, her face draining of color. I didn't mean to, she stammered, her voice trembling. I thought you'd block. Rimuru took a step forward, the blade sinking deeper into his body. He didn't flinch. His crimson eyes locked onto Bianca's, and his smile twisted into something far more sinister. Only one slash, he reminded her, his voice unnervingly calm. He raised his own sword slowly, the motion deliberate and chilling. In one swift movement, he slashed across Bianca's cheek, leaving a thin line of blood. She gasped, stumbling back as her hand flew to her face. The sting of the cut was sharp, but the fear in her eyes was far greater. Ah! Bianca screamed, her voice echoing through the hall as she scrambled away from him. Rimuru pulled the sword from his abdomen with an almost casual motion. He held it up briefly, inspecting the bloodied blade before tossing it to the ground. There wasn't a single drop of blood on his body, his wound had already closed, leaving nothing but pristine skin behind. I win, he said simply, his tone cold and final. He tossed both swords toward Bianca, the clatter of the metal making her flinch. She stared at him, her breathing rapid, her face pale with terror. Rimuru turned to Wednesday, who was watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Shall we? He asked, his tone light, almost playful. The nurse's office, perhaps. Wednesday didn't reply. She simply turned and walked toward the door, her movements as composed as ever. Rimuru followed, but not before glancing back at Bianca. His smile returned, sharp and predatory. Next time, he said softly, his voice dripping with menace. Bianca didn't respond. She couldn't. She was frozen, her hand still pressed to the shallow cut on her cheek. The door closed behind Rimuru and Wednesday, leaving the room in complete silence. The teacher stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. The students exchanged nervous glances, none of them daring to speak. Even the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. In the hallway, Rimuru walked beside Wednesday, his hands tucked into his pockets. Interesting technique, he remarked casually. You're not half bad with a sword. Wednesday glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. And you're not half bad at unnerving an entire room, she replied dryly. Rimuru chuckled, his voice low and smooth. What can I say? I like to keep things entertaining. Wednesday said nothing, her gaze fixed ahead. Rimuru watched her for a moment longer, a faint smile still lingering on his lips. This school just got a lot more interesting, he thought. Wednesday's pav. The nurse dabbed antiseptic on my forehead with a gentleness I neither needed nor appreciated. Her hands fluttered around me like a nervous bird, carefully smoothing a plaster over the scratch Bianca had so graciously given me. I could sense her discomfort, her eyes darting nervously between my expressionless face and the looming figure of Rimuru Nightshade standing to my side. He hadn't moved since we entered the infirmary. His presence was like a shadow, silent but suffocating, lingering in a way that made me want to claw at it and see what was underneath. I refused to look at him. Acknowledging his existence would only feed whatever strange amusement he seemed to derive from my irritation. I let the nurse finish her unnecessary fussing, keeping my face impassive. Any sign of discomfort would only validate her misguided attempts at care. Wednesday. The voice broke through the quiet, pulling my attention to the doorway. I turned to see Rowan, his arm in a sling and a sheepish expression plastered across his face. He looked like a wounded puppy, unsure whether to approach or retreat. He shuffled closer, his eyes flicking between Rimuru and me. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry for what happened earlier," he said awkwardly. And, thanks for stepping in. That was badass. I tilted my head slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Compliments are like needles in a haystack, they're not worth the effort of digging out. Rowan turned his attention to Rimuru, his face lighting up with nervous curiosity. You're pretty cool too, you know. Actually, it's kind of odd for a vampire. Rimuru's lips curved into a faint smile, one that sent an unexplainable shiver down my spine. My name is Rimuru Nightshade. Call me whatever you like, he said smoothly, his voice carrying a cold amusement that felt more like a veiled threat than an invitation. Rowan nodded hesitantly, then quickly looked away. Yeah, Rimuru. Cool. You're just different. For a vampire, I mean. I narrowed my eyes, my interest piqued despite myself. What do you mean by that? I asked, my voice as sharp as the edge of a blade. Rowan hesitated, his lips parting as if to explain, but then he shook his head. Nothing. Never mind. I filed his words away for later. People often reveal more than they intend when they think you've stopped paying attention. Standing up, I adjusted my collar and prepared to leave. Rowan's voice stopped me just as I reached the door. Thanks, Wednesday, he said earnestly. I turned my head slightly, my voice flat. Good deeds never go unpunished, I replied, stepping out into the hallway without waiting for a response. Rimuru followed, his footsteps eerily quiet against the stone floor. Of course, he wouldn't stay behind. His presence lingered at my back like a ghost, cold and unyielding. As I walked, my thoughts drifted back to Rowan's strange comment. Odd for a vampire, he had said. There was no doubt Rimuru was peculiar, his calm, his detached amusement, the way he seemed to revel in the discomfort of others. But there was something else, something deeper. Rowan had seen it, even if he wouldn't explain. I glanced over my shoulder, catching Rimuru's crimson gaze. He didn't look away, his expression unreadable. What are you hiding, Rimuru Nightshade? The unease gnawed at the edges of my mind. I prided myself on seeing through people, on peeling back their carefully constructed facades to reveal the rot beneath. But Rimuru was different, his darkness an enigma that seemed to mirror my own in ways I wasn't entirely comfortable with. Lost in thought, I continued walking, barely noticing Rimuru's persistent presence until I stopped abruptly and turned to face him. Why are you? My words were cut off as something solid collided with me. Pain blossomed at the back of my head, and the world tilted violently. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Rimuru's expression, calm, detached, and entirely too knowing. What just happened? Then, there was nothing.